You'll remember from last lesson that apart from Mr. Rochester's grand party of guests, two mysterious visitors have arrived at Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester has briefly stepped out on business, so he doesn't know about these gate crashes. One is Mr. Mason, who's travelled all the way from Jamaica and says he's a friend of Mr. Rochester's. The second is a fortune teller who refuses to leave until she's spoken to all the young single ladies in the house. Blanche Ingram's reading with her was clearly a disaster, so what's in store for Jane? As she enters the library, Jane sees the old crone. She sure is a striking-looking creature. She boldly looks Jane in the eye, but Jane doesn't flinch. She doesn't believe in fortune-telling, but she's ready to listen. The woman reprimands Jane for not grasping happiness when it's right in front of her. It's a bold opening, and Jane is intrigued. But the woman's advice is still vague, so Jane allows her to read her palm and face. The woman asks probing questions about Jane's emotions and reveals details about Jane's habits in the house. But how could she know something like that? She's in league with Grace Poole. Is this some sort of sick joke? But the old woman assures Jane that Grace Poole is trustworthy. She then tries to draw out Jane's thoughts about marriage and whom she admires most. But Jane isn't having it. She's here for advice, not confession. It's as if the old woman can sense the tension between Jane and Mr. Rochester, especially now that Blanche is on the scene. The old woman reveals that she told Blanche that Mr. Rochester isn't as rich as people think. Let's see if Blanche still fancies him after that. She then asks Jane to kneel down again so she can get another look at her face. This time, she analyses Jane closely and reads her like a book. Jane is entranced. But then the old woman's voice changes, and she speaks in a way that sounds so familiar. And that ring she's wearing. Hang on. Edward Rochester? Is that you? Oh, that's so unfair. Wait, did Jane say anything embarrassing? No, Mr. Rochester assures her that she was guarded, as always. Phew. Jane then tells him about the visitor from Jamaica, Mr. Mason. This is terrible news for Mr. Rochester. He becomes weak and even leans on Jane for support. The two men obviously have history. Mr. Rochester is terrified that Mason will expose him and turn everyone against him. But Jane assures Mr. Rochester that she would never desert him. Who is this foreigner? And what damaging secrets does he know? At Mr. Rochester's request, Jane quietly approaches Mr. Mason and asks him to join Mr. Rochester in the library. They need to chat in private, so she leaves them to it. Later that night, Jane hears someone scream in the room directly above her. Then there's a violent struggle, and someone cries out for help. Of course, all the guests rush out of their rooms, terrified and demanding answers. Rochester appears and tells them all to calm down. It was nothing, just a servant having a nightmare. But Jane can tell that it's not nothing. Something has happened. She can see it in his dark, wild eyes. So she re-enters her room, gets dressed, and waits. Sure enough, a short time later, Mr. Rochester quietly raps on her door and retrieves her. He needs her help. Mr. Rochester takes Jane's hand and leads her into one of those gloomy, old-fashioned bedrooms on the third floor. Inside is Mr. Mason, semi-conscious and bleeding profusely down one arm. Mr. Rochester must leave to fetch a doctor. In the meantime, Jane's job is to sponge off the blood that's trickling down the man's arm and keep him awake with smelling salts. What a nightmare! This must be Grace Poole's handiwork again. That villain. Before he leaves, Mr. Rochester orders Jane and Mr. Mason not to speak to one another while he's gone. In fact, Mr. Mason's life seems to depend on him staying silent. This makes for a tense nursing shift for the next 2 hours. Jane's mind swims with questions. Is this man going to die? Are they safe? Or is Grace Poole going to jump out and attack them? What was Mr. Mason doing up in here anyway? And why can't they talk about it? Meanwhile, Mason begins to moan and droop. Hurry up, Mr. Rochester. This guy doesn't look so good. Finally, at dawn, Mr. Rochester returns with Dr. Carter. Mr. Mason will live, but he's been savagely mauled. First, the she-devil stabbed him. Then, when Rochester got the knife off her, she ripped into Mr. Mason with her teeth. Now it's a race against the clock. They need to patch him up and get him out of here before anyone suspects anything. As Dr. Carter works, Mr. Rochester rallies Mr. Mason to prevent him from passing out. They talk about the attack, and Mason says he didn't expect it because she looked so quiet. But Mr. Rochester scolds him for trying to speak to the woman alone. Finally, they get Mr. Mason in reasonable shape, quietly move him downstairs, and bundle him into a waiting carriage. But at the last moment, Mr. Mason bursts into tears. He begs Mr. Rochester to take good care of the demon who attacked him, and Mr. Rochester promises he will. Never a dull moment at Thornfield Hall. Before they return to the house, Mr. Rochester asks Jane to take some air with him in the orchard. He gives her a rose, and they chat about last night's events. Mr. Rochester tells Jane not to worry about Grace Poole and try to forget about all the trouble she's caused. Easier said than done, Edward. He then calls Jane his little friend and talks about his life. He deeply regrets a major error he committed long ago, but he's very close to happiness now. The only thing preventing him from having it is a pesky social convention. Jane waits eagerly for him to reveal the source of his happiness, but all he does is stare at her. He then breaks the spell by mentioning Blanche Ingram, his buxom, lovely one, and marriage. Well, that's classic Rochester. Hot 1 minute and cold the next. Poor Jane. A short time later, Jane gets the chance to get away from Thornfield for a while. She receives an unexpected invitation to return to Gateshead Hall, where she was brought up. There's been trouble since she left there 9 years ago to attend Lowood School. John Reed, her cousin and tormentor, squandered his family's wealth and killed himself a week ago. The news of his death caused his mother, the formidable Mrs. Reed, to suffer a major stroke. She's now very weak and confined to her bed, but has been constantly asking for Jane. Jane is willing to answer the summons, but first she must take leave from Mr. Rochester. He allows Jane to take leave and, so that she can travel comfortably, gives her part of her salary. But he makes her promise that she'll return and not abandon him to live at Gateshead. While living at Gateshead is out of the question, Jane points something out. When he marries Miss Ingram, Adele should go to school, and Jane must find another position. Mr. Rochester understands, but becomes agitated by the thought of Jane leaving. He even forbids her from advertising for a job. When the time comes, he'll arrange a new situation for Jane himself. She must trust him. Then they part awkwardly as he struggles to say farewell. Jane's return to Gateshead is an eventful one. Bessie greets her warmly, but Georgiana and Eliza Reed do not. They're barely civil to Jane and clearly at odds with each other. When Jane goes in to see Mrs. Reed, it's not a happy reunion, although Jane tries to be kind. Mrs. Reed recognises Jane but can't bring herself to accept Jane's affection, even now. She then starts rambling about the past, her son John, as though he were still alive. Jane decides to wait until Mrs. Reed is more lucid before speaking to her again. In the meantime, she has to deal with Georgiana and Eliza. Georgiana is more selfish and frivolous than ever, and Eliza is a stern loner who lives by a fastidious routine. They're also at each other's throats because Eliza deliberately ruined Georgiana's marriage prospects with a high-born gentleman. As soon as Mrs. Reed croaks, these two will cut ties forever. One stormy afternoon, Jane goes in to see Mrs. Reed again. She finds her awake, semi-lucid, and ready to talk. She summoned Jane because she has two big regrets to unload. One is that she broke her promise to Jane's uncle by not raising Jane as one of her own. Her other regret may have more lasting consequences. 3 years ago, Mrs. Reed received a letter from a man named Jane Eyre. He's Jane's uncle on her father's side. He'd gone overseas to start a business and became successful. He wrote to Mrs. Reed inquiring about Jane because he wanted to adopt her and leave her his fortune in his will. But Mrs. Reed, in all her vengeful wickedness, replied that Jane had died in the typhus outbreak at Lowood School. After Jane's sudden outburst 9 years ago, Mrs. Reed couldn't bear to see Jane happy and prosperous. But now Jane is free to write to Mr. Eyre and tell him she's alive, if it's not too late. Mrs. Reed remains stuck in her hatred, but Jane is ready to forgive and forget. She tells the dying woman that all is forgiven, but Mrs. Reed refuses to soften. She then dies a few hours later. Jane stays a month at Gateshead to help Georgiana and Eliza pack up and prepare for the next phase of their lives. In the end, Georgiana does marry a gentleman, and Eliza travels to France to join a convent. Good luck to them. Jane's summertime return to Thornfield is a joyful one. She even walks the last few miles from Millcote. As the twilight draws in, she encounters Mr. Rochester in a laneway. Is he a ghost? Or is that really him, sitting on some stone steps and writing something? It's him. He greets her warmly and playfully, and she basks in his presence. But the reality is, he's recently been to London to buy a new carriage for his bride. No doubt she'll be very happy with it. Anyway, let's just ignore that and enjoy the time these two have left as the master and governess of Thornfield Hall. This really does feel like home for Jane, especially when she receives such a pleasant reception from Mrs. Fairfax and Adele. All the guests have gone now, so they can relax. Jane wishes they could all just stay together somehow. Jane then notices something weird. There aren't any preparations happening for Mr. Rochester's wedding. He's bought a pretty new carriage, but what about everything else? Has it been called off? Dare Jane hope? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.